You're tuned into the Counterflow Podcast, home of dissident voices,
unapproved opinions.
But you gotta get ready.
You ready?
Now here's your host
and humble narrator,
Buck Johnson. Let's go.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you once again out of Lockhart, Texas, the barbecue capital of the world. Fellow Texan nearby, not too far away, and fellow traveler with me and Father Peter Hears and a host of others to Mount Athos last summer. My friend, Conrad Franz from the World War Now podcast is with us today. We're going to break down some geopolitical events going on. As you know, around the globe, there's actually kinetic hot wars going on that, unfortunately, no matter what they say, we do have a lot to do with, especially financing these conflicts. And Conrad knows a lot about this. If you look at it from an Orthodox perspective, we can find a lot of prophecies from certain saints regarding these geopolitical conflicts, what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on up there with Russia and Ukraine and Syria. The prophecies of the saints have spoken to these actual events and what may be happening here in the future, what has happened. And we're going to get into all of that with Conrad. It's basically an Orthodox look at the geopolitical events going on across the world right now and the impact it will have on the future of this world. Without further ado, let's get Conrad Franz, my friend. Welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
Doing well, man. It's good to be here. I know we've done Counterflow before, and we, of course, did our Athos trip together. So it's always an easy transition to come in to talk with my friend Buck Johnson.
Yeah. It's funny when I get personal friends on, then I'm not ratting you out or anything, but like they're like, oh, I'm going to be a little bit late or whatever. And it's like, it's just my friend. It's okay. Talk about, before I'll let you plug, because you, as we were in Athos together last year, things were transitioning with the show where it's your full-time job. And so I always want to get, I want to get you to plug anything you'd like anyway, but if it's your full-time job and you've been doing these live streams now, solo style, of course, Dimitri's still on the official show. Plug anything you'd like before we get started, because, we want also your Patreon, which I think you said mysterious number 33, its rankings right now. So talk about anything you'd like as far as plugging your material goes, and then they're going to understand why, once you do that, we're having this discussion.
Oh, for sure. And again, thank you for having me on, Buck. If everybody wants to see what I'm doing, you can find me on the World War Now Substack. That's sort of our home base, worldwarnow.co. If you want to support the show, obviously that's where you can get behind the paywall, get access to all of our, at this point, hundreds of hours of Ether Hour premium content. We have interviews with Father John Whiteford, Father Peter Hears, Cameron McGregor, Jim Jatris, all sorts of people that I know the Counterflow audience are also familiar with. So a really good array of shows. Yeah, and like you said, I'm doing these weekly live streams. I'm calling them World War Live. As of now, they're on the World War Now YouTube channel and the X account. So that's World War Now on YouTube and then World War Now _ on X. Hopefully in the very near future, we will be having Substack live streaming as well, because they should be getting that out on desktop. Right now, it only exists on like the mobile app, and I'm not gonna do that while I'm streaming on the computer, but hopefully that will be coming soon. And as you mentioned, Substack World War Now. At one point, we were number 33 in the rising world politics Substacks. Overall, in all of world politics on the platform of Substack, we are ranked 70th. So that is very good. I'm very proud of that. And if anybody wants to check out the show, we release all the episodes usually on Sundays for the main show on the Substack. Then we release them on YouTube the next day. And then during the week, whether it be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, sometimes the occasional Friday show, that's when we release Ether Hour, which is our supporter show for people that get behind the paywall. And that's where we talk about all sorts of general stuff, not just the ongoing Third World War. So I think that's the gist of it.
I'm so glad to hear shows like yours or Substacks like yours, content like yours, rising up the charts, if you will. There's this, I've talked about it on this show a lot. I'm sure you're well aware of it's like we're living in it, but this dying off of the legacy media, that's good. That's gone. That's a good thing. And now it's very apparent these sort of gatekeepers are trying to infiltrate the podcast space. I'm sure I don't even like to say his name, but Douglas Murray's been making the rounds, and these gatekeepers, what's his name, from the gay guy that goes around with Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin. He's blocked me, so I'm blocking his name. But these guys, it's very apparent the subversive elements that are still trying to represent the view. It's like the Zionist view, even though it's like, hey, remember me? I was like your entry into the alternative media world. I'm cool, right? I'm hip. I'm down. I hate the legacy media, but you speak against Israel, and we're coming after you. Have you seen? I assume you noticed this too.
Oh yeah, definitely. And one of the funniest parts about it is that they can't actually like have an organic person with an audience rise up because those people don't really exist. Like you see their attempts at making these like new media leftists. That's why you get like Harry Sisson, Dean Withers, like these types of characters. And, no one's taking that seriously. So they got to bring in these people, Dave Rubin, Douglas Murray, who, they had some clout in sort of the early days of the internet stuff where like you still ultimately would have a leg up if you had, $10 million or $1 million or something like this to get your little online studio, your Louder with Crowder studio or your, these sorts of things. Not calling out Crowder just as an example, but like those are the people that had to get in. These aren't actual like for you and me. I mean, our entire audience comes from the past few years of just this new space that we're in, and they have to bring these people who ultimately they have skeletons in their closet. I mean, Douglas Murray, he's well connected with all of these NGOs, all of this, whether it's what's going on in the UK or the US. So it's the same game. It's still, the establishment, but because these people, are capable of talking on a podcast, like the Douglas Murray thing, everyone was like, the establishment was acting as if it was the greatest thing that had ever happened. And it's like, okay, this is just maybe the first time that one of your people didn't get absolutely embarrassed. And even then, I still think, Dave Smith, I think, held his own. I'm not faulting him for that. But in general, these people they're not actual, I mean, I'm not even a populist, but they're not actual populist figures. Like they don't actually have they're not on the pulse of the people. They don't have a sort of organic following. And of course, you saw Jordan Peterson recently, like calling out the Groypers. The reason they have to keep calling out these types of people is because, they'd rather ignore them, but ultimately it's gotten to the point where they just can't.
Yes. I mentioned to Jay in the last episode, it feels like guys like that are kind of headed towards a waterfall off the cliff, and they're grasping at twigs, like trying to remain relevant as they see like, damn it, this is dying because it's astroturfed. And so I think a lot of people started figuring that out when Trump or Elon or whoever it was went after USAID a little bit. And you realize, wait a second, these like voices are not organic. And I mean, it was very obvious, like you said, Pete or Sisson or whatever his name is, and Brooklyn Dad, and these kind of weird voices on Twitter that just repeat boilerplate talking points. And you're like, how does he have so many followers? This is stupid stuff, but that's how. To your show, and I think this is relevant to the discussion, sort of the premise of it is that we are in World War III, so to speak, now. It's not like this thing that is coming down the road. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think obviously on the show, we do talk about how we're on the precipice of a much more kinetic, part of, I guess, World War III. But from a few different angles, of course, one of the main ones just being, it's a famous Marshall McLuhan quote. It says, the Third World War is ultimately an information war with no distinction between civilian and military capabilities, which obviously, I mean, you could argue we've been in that since, the end of the Second World War in many ways. But more than that as well, I was able to go to Cyprus right before we met up in Mount Athos. I went and met my hero, besides Jesus himself, my living, worldly fallen hero, Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu, who, of course, during COVID was standing against all of that, warning, talking about the prophecies of well-known saints, Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios, Saint Iacovos, Eldris Galactia, Elder Ephraim, all of these, very holy people from the latter half of the 20th century that many Orthodox Christians are familiar with. And he said, right in the midst of the Ukraine war, he's like, we are already in the second year of the Third World War. And a lot of people have speculated that started in Syria. A lot of people have talked about what happened in Libya back in the day. And I think when the Ukraine war broke out in 2022, the special military operation, especially considering how much Orthodoxy was specifically involved and still is involved in that specific conflict, for somebody like him and for other sort of holy, wise people within the church, it became very clear that the hot phase of this Third World War has very much arrived and is going to continue escalating for the foreseeable future.
We've got a new sponsor. It is Perfect Spiral Capital. This is the infinity banking concept. Break free from the system. Perfect Spiral Capital helps you build wealth on your terms outside of the control of the corporate banking cartel and the state-manipulated markets. Invest like a dissident, a true dissident. Take ownership of your financial future with strategies designed for those who refuse to be cogs in the machine. No handouts, no bailouts, just real results. Opt out, build wealth. The state inflates your savings away while Wall Street rigs the game. You guys know this. Perfect Spiral Capital helps you stack real assets and create lasting independence. Go to perfectspiralcapital.com/counterflow and get a special offer for fans of this show. Again, that's perfectspiralcapital.com/counterflow. I want to, when we cover some of these topics, the violence and kinetic wars that are happening in various parts of the world, I want to talk about it and discuss the lies and propaganda, the quote unquote narrative that's being fed, and then the truth as you've been learning it with each conflict, and then some prophecies from certain saints, like you just alluded to. I guess it's obvious: Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, and Russia, but I think Syria is interesting to discuss in this too. Can you talk about what happened to Bashar al-Assad? Let's hear the propaganda and the live version first, and then what actually happened and why.
Well, in many ways, it's still one of the most complex ones to parse through right now, because for those that don't know, obviously a few months back, Bashar al-Assad, who had been in charge of Syria for a long, long time, so he had been in charge throughout the entirety of the civil war that broke out in 2011. In many ways, the hottest parts of the war had kind of died down. So the idea that he was going to get overthrown was, even amongst the side that wanted to overthrow him, it wasn't exactly like people had almost given up on that idea. And of course, on our side of things, there's all the, who must go? Assad must go. That was a big meme about how he was sort of this unfazable, kind of force. And he stood up against, he of course led a sort of coalition of these religious minorities in Syria: Christians, Alawites, Shia, Druze, these disparate groups against a Sunni majority that, are more aligned with Wahhabism or maybe some of these other more extremist ideologies. But then what occurred, of course, was like almost overnight, what has now been revealed to effectively have been a sort of operation that was kind of worked out behind the scenes with Turkey, Qatar, potentially even Russia, some have said have been involved. They overran the north of Syria. Assad fled to Latakia, which is on the coast. And next thing you know, he was on a Russian flight out of there to Moscow. And of course, the mainstream media says, finally, after years, the people rose up. They overthrew this brutal dictator and freedom has been restored to Syria. And you, of course, hear about them wanting to normalize with Israel. You hear about them immediately, stopping the support for Hezbollah and these other resistance groups that exist in Lebanon. And obviously, the military has now been incorporated. It were these disparate groups: HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Syrian National Army. And these are effectively, I don't want to say directly ISIS, but they are ISIS allies. These are forces like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham used to literally be Al-Qaeda in Syria. These are sort of the things that occurred there. But the reason it's also so relevant is because obviously Assad was considered to be backed by Russia and Iran. And so it was sort of an extension of the proxy war between Israel and Iran. And then many people wonder, is this, directly proving that Russia is on Iran's side? But then there's the whole Russia-Israel connection. These are the sort of things I talk about on the show. But when it comes to, specifically, you mentioned some of those prophecies. The big thing with the prophecies as well that have been predicted that many would call perhaps outside of the realpolitik geopolitical box, because a lot of our show is just real on the ground analysis of what's happening. But where we start to, I don't want to say stray, but where we start to differ from just the kind of secular analyst people is we do believe there will be a big clash between Russia and Turkey, which a lot of people will say, oh, that's not going to happen. Turkey's this NATO country. Erdogan is an ally of Russia. There's this nuanced situation going on that would prevent that from happening. But I believe that if any number of those nodes that I just said get disrupted, then we will be very much on a crash course towards that. Obviously, let's say Turkey leaves NATO. That gives them a big opening for Russia to come in and do something if they go against them. Let's say Erdogan falls and a Kemalist, secularist, less Islamist government comes into power. They're going to move towards NATO to the point where Turkey would be much more, it would be almost more akin to a Poland or an Italy or one of these countries that have, very much come out against Russia. But when it comes to the prophecies, which many of these come from St. Paisios, Turkey is very, very key in all of this. And perhaps, I don't want to say my favorite prophecy. Many of these are very bleak things that we talk about and pray for repentance that they could be ameliorated. But one of the most fascinating ones from possibly my favorite saint of the 20th century, Saint Philomenos of Jacob's Well, who was martyred by radical Zionists in the West Bank in 1979. He has a prophecy about how Georgia will melt like a candle. The Russians will come through it. And I don't know if that means there will be a military defeat or if there won't even, if Russia will just march through unimpeded. That's sort of what I think is going to happen as Georgia shifts more towards the Russian sphere of influence. But basically, the Russians will descend through Georgia into Turkey and Syria and defeat the Turks there. And they will make it all the way down to Mount Tabor, which of course is in northern Israel. And St. Philomenos said the Russians wouldn't make it any far past that. And of course, I think the big question that I ask is, will the Russians in this situation be going against Israel? Will they be going with Israel? Because right now, Turkey and Israel are, I think it is a bit of a show, but Turkey and Israel are moving towards, I don't want to say a clash, but their relations are definitely straining in the sense that Erdogan obviously stands with Hamas. Turkey is one of the last Muslim Brotherhood holdout countries that still sort of openly supports that, that faction, which is Hamas. They are Muslim Brotherhood Sunni, as opposed to the rest of the Islamic resistance against Israel, which are Shia, supported by Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, the groups in Jordan, these sorts of things. So I think with Syria, it might be the most, it might have the most connections to all these different prophecies. I mean, even China, there's even connections with the war in China because there are prophecies that say that the Euphrates will be drunk dry by the Chinese who will send an army force across Central Asia. So I think Syria is a great place to start when people want to think about these things because they border Turkey, they border Palestine and Israel. They're very directly connected with Russia and Iran. So it is kind of, even though right now Iran and Israel and Russia, Ukraine are the most kinetic parts of this sort of conflict, Syria is kind of where diplomatically, prophetically, civilizationally, everything does kind of come together.
And I think it's important to note, and this is not anything new to a lot of people, but just to get it out there in case, the leadership in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, it is now gone, was, as you mentioned, protecting Christians there. And so we've seen some of the destruction that has happened post Bashar al-Assad. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, obviously, like I said, Assad, I mean, I used to go, for example, I was catechized at a very ethnic Syrian parish when I was, I was received here in Texas, but I was catechized when I was in college up in New York City. And the church was very ethnically Syrian. And many of the people there would even say that, because Assad, he was this Alawite. And for those that don't know, Alawites, it's, I don't know, you can almost describe it as like a schismatic Muslim sect. They're sort of like a hybrid between a lot of Christian and Christian aesthetics and Shia Islam. They're like very non-iconoclastic, for example, unlike Sunnis. They have a lot of reverence for Christians. Many, like they honor Jesus more than even other Muslims. So this obviously lent itself to him being, able to unite a lot of these minority groups. But for example, in the past, I can't remember when it was, if it was in March or February, there was that big massacre, largely of Alawites as well as of Christians in the Latakia region of Syria. So if you look at a map of Syria, there's that strip of coast above Lebanon, below Turkey, and that region is called Latakia, and it is where almost all of the Alawites, for example, live. So it was definitely Assad's political stronghold in many ways. And Alawites and Christians, for example, they live alongside each other a lot more easy than the Christians and the Muslims live beside each other. Even certain Muslim groups within that live inside each other. Then there's the Druze, who are these weird satanic pagan mystic Jew things that are very much itching to get annexed by Israel. So that's a whole story in and of itself. But the massacre that occurred, many Latakian Alawites, many Latakian Christians were slaughtered by the Al-Jalani, now known as Al-Shura, HTS, former Al-Qaeda aligned groups. And many people have been discussing, I still go to an Antiochian parish, so I know a lot of people from these regions. And at this point, unfortunately, as much as people that had kind of rallied around Assad would like to see a united Syria, to see a Syria where everybody, the whole state under one government, at this point, it appears that the best thing that the Christians and these minority groups is going to hope for is some kind of partition, where this coastal region would become an Alawite Christian state, where there would be this Druze thing in the south, which apparently they don't want that. They just want to get annexed by Israel. Then in the north, near Turkey, you'd have, of course, the more Sunni Wahhabist group. And then, of course, in the northeast of the region, you have Syrian Kurdistan, which borders Iraqi Kurdistan, which, if you count Syrian, Iraqi, and even some of these other immediate areas around it with all the Kurds, it's technically the largest. They're the largest, like, stateless people that currently exist with a de facto state that's unrecognized. So, unfortunately, yes, there is much targeting and much fear among the Christians and other minority groups in Syria right now. For example, there were Wahhabis that were warning they were going to cut the head off the Orthodox bishop of Aleppo. There was apparently a bounty at one point, which, they tried to say was fake, but it was definitely real at one point, on Patriarch John X himself, the patriarch of the Antiochian church. So in many ways, much like the Christians in Palestine face Israeli oppression, so are the Christians and Alawites facing that in Syria. And yes, sure, it is this Muslim group that's doing it, but the Muslim group only took power, obviously, at the behest of Israel. Everybody sort of creates the dichotomy of, it's Christians versus Muslims. And yes, I am no pro-Muslim. I'm no humanist. I'm not in favor of that. But for better or for worse, Assad was a Muslim ruler, maybe a weird sort of heretical version of it. But there are Muslim countries that do live peacefully with the Christians. I would say the West Bank and Gaza, in many ways, the Christians there do face, and it's not 100%, but I think they do face less oppressive and centrally planned church persecution than what goes on in Israel. I mean, you see what goes on in Jerusalem. The Armenian quarter has been almost decimated entirely. The Zionists are trying to drive out all Armenian Christians from there. You saw what happened at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Holy Saturday, just this past week. They kicked out Orthodox priests. They banned Armenians from being in there. They were disrespectfully standing on the stones near Christ's tomb. So, yes, obviously we know that, Muslim oppression of Christians is egregious, but you can't talk about that without acknowledging that the worst of the Wahhabi Salafist Muslim offenders are directly financially and intelligent and on the intelligence front backed by Israel.
We've got some new shirts, Counterflow with Buck Johnson on the front pocket, on the back, a beautiful graphic with, of course, dissident voices and unapproved opinions. You can see this on the YouTube version of the show. Of course, we're putting the graphic up now. $30 flat fee. $30 gets you the t-shirt. The PayPal address is buck@counterflowpodcast.com. That is my PayPal. You can send $30 that method. Send me your address and the size you want. We have sizes small through 2XL. Again, sizes small through 2XL. Go to PayPal, $30 buck@counterflowpodcast.com. Give me your address in there and the t-shirt will be yours. Yes, that detail never gets discussed. And I'm glad you are talking about this because I was going to get to it. I think it's an American, and I fall into it all the time, and even when I'm aware of it, it's an American sort of instinct for this dialectical nature of whatever's happening. Like, so you're against what Israel's doing? Well, you must be pro-Hamas. Even back when people after 2001. You're trying to explain Ron Paul was trying to explain the foreign policy issues of why people might have been upset with this. Oh, so you like bin Laden? It's like, no. Talk about the nuance that has to be used when you're discussing, for instance, what's happening in Gaza right now between Palestine and Israel. And, well, then you just must like them, that sort of attitude.
Well, it's perfect. It's a genius game of media control and dialectics, right? It's like, a bunch of people are starting to get skeptical of Israel and Zionism and sort of the Jewish fifth column that exists in the United States and the West. What do? Well, let's prop up an enemy of ours that we know is narratively toxic. I mean, look at what happened in Gaza. the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which of course has relation to Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, for a long time, they were by far the dominant force in Palestine, and they were ostensibly secular. They were Christians, Muslims, communists, all sorts of people, in this group standing against Israel, uniting people. I've had Isaac Swalem on my show many times. You don't have to be a genius to realize that what the Israelis fear in the region is secular Arab nationalism. That's in theory, if that project had ever worked, that would have been able to drive Israel out of the region. So what does Israel do? They prop up Islamist organizations. And one thing people say, they think Hamas is directly backed by Israel. I don't think that's the case at all. An opportunity was created within Gaza through Israeli intelligence and soft power to allow Hamas to take over. And I believe Hamas, I don't think these guys that are all dying in Gaza are doing it for Israel. They are genuinely fighting against the Zionists. But it's a lot harder to get international support if you are a Wahhabist organization whose main support comes from Qatar. You hear about all this talk, and now it's oh, you're funded by Qatar, you're Qatar. That is an Israeli talking point. That is, they realized how the cat was out of the bag on the fact that everyone's funded by Israel. Everyone knows Ben Shapiro effectively works for Israel. He probably takes calls from Netanyahu multiple times a month to discuss what he talks about on the show. Douglas Murray, like we talked about earlier, he's allowed to go into Gaza. You can't just go to Gaza. You think you or me could just go to Gaza right now? No.
You've never been? You've never been?
Which is funny that he would say that, because the only reason he got to go is because he's embedded with the IDF. That's right. It's just such a silly point that he tried to make. But this idea that, of course, the dialogue. I mean, look, what was it said? That interview with that Mossad guy who did the interview after the pager attack with Hezbollah. He said, "We create entire narratives. We control the conversation." That's exactly what. It's exactly what they're doing right now, to the point where it doesn't matter how nuanced you are in explaining your perspective on the situation, you will be accused of being just on the opposite side of a dialectic that they created. And on the one hand, yes, obviously don't fall for it and become a full-on, Muslim supporter. But at the same time, don't let some Jewish Zionist who is not a Christian try to call you out for siding with Muslims as a Christian. Those people aren't Christians either. So just because somebody is a Muslim doesn't mean that there can't be a short-term political goal that could be shared, especially amongst the Shia. I've made this point a lot of times on my show. There's sort of a tier list of, I guess you could say, enemies of Zionists in Israel. And of course, the top enemy, I've always said, are Orthodox Christians specifically. You might say Oriental Orthodox are up there as well, because they really do hate Armenians. Then right below that, you've got the Roman Catholics. And in a religious way, the reason Zionists are Jews just like this is because Christians, they consider them polytheists. Obviously, they worship Jesus, who's enemy number one for Zionist Jews. And then you, of course, have the fact that we are not iconoclastic. But we have these, they accuse us of being these idol worshipers. And ironically, then that gets you to the next tier down, which I would say Protestants are actually lower on the list than, for example, Shia Muslims. Shia Muslims, obviously with their home base being Iran, is the main reason why they are sort of Islamic enemy number one for Israel. But more than that, from a theological perspective, Shia Muslims are not iconoclasts. They have even been known to depict, I don't know if it's the Prophet, but they depict the other imams, for example, Imam Ali, some of these characters, they are willing to depict them in religious art, which if you go to Sunni areas, there's no depictions of, it's all just geometric shapes and these sorts of things. And then after that, you'd, of course, would have the Sunni Muslims. And then I've even ranked the Druze, these sort of weird pagan, Jewish, Muslim syncretist characters that exist in Syria. So there's a sort of ranking that I think a lot of the Israelis have in their mind based on both geopolitical and theological realities. And obviously, public enemy number one is Christ and his church, which is why Christians have been completely driven out of all power centers within the Middle East and the areas surrounding Israel. The only country surrounding Israel that could even be called meaningfully Christian is Cyprus, and half of it's occupied by Turkey. So they've been disempowered. Then you, of course, have the Shia, who have very much been disempowered as well. They aren't in power in Egypt. They aren't in power in Jordan. They are now no longer in power in Syria. And so they exist only in these fractious groups like Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and then, of course, Iran itself, which doesn't even have a border with Israel. So the Greater Israel Project is very much focused on driving these groups out, I think specifically in that order, based on how much of a threat the Israelis perceive them, both to their state project and to their kind of antichrist plan for the entire world.
Which major conflict or even minor conflict are around the world right now has nothing to do with Israel?
It's a good question because people would try to point to maybe something in South America, but ultimately the situation in South America is with Venezuela so volatile because of the energy war. Venezuela wouldn't be as important of this energy source for the Western Hemisphere if all the energy in the Middle East wasn't tied up in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which of course is where Israel is directly trying to get us as their thalassocratic attack dog. I mean, we've got 3 carrier strike groups surrounding Iran and Lebanon right now. So you really can't say it. Obviously, the China-Taiwan situation, part of China being targeted is because they are Iran's lifeline. They are the number one purchaser of Iranian crude oil. So if China gets in trouble, obviously Iran's going to lose a big customer. And even then, persecuting Iran is going to have an effect on China, which we know is the whole trade war thing. Obviously, that's the big economic war between the US and Iran. So obviously, there are some conflicts that may have less to do with Israel than others, but there's always a connection, especially when you consider that the Mossad, for how small Israel is, how much of an outsized intelligence influence they have. And even more than that, this is the very controversial part. You ultimately do have to consider almost all, with very rare exceptions, because the exceptions will make it known to you that most of organized Judaism, the religion around the world, can also be looked at as representing Israel. Look at Russia. Russia stands with Palestine. Russia stands with Iran. They even now have, I think, defense alliances with Iran. Yet you go to Russia, and Putin's meeting with Chabad Lubavitch, Beryl Lazar, multiple times a year. And Beryl Lazar is friends with Netanyahu. They're direct, they know each other. Putin and Netanyahu are friends. So there's, even in countries that you might not say are directly on side, the Zionists have, they've got their contingency plan there set up. They don't let things slip through the cracks.
Once a month, my supporters of this show and myself and a special guest have a Zoom meeting. It's not recorded, it's not posted, it's just private. It's between you guys, the guest, and myself. I do this because it means a lot for you guys who support me by showing me that this show means a lot to you. I love talking with you. I look at it as a benefit for people that support the show, but it's really a benefit for me. I get to know you guys and have an off-the-record discussion with our guest. And, sometimes topics you don't want to necessarily have all the ins and outs discussed online, if you know what I mean. So to be in this group, please go to patreon.com/counterflow and donate $5 or more per month. And it gets you in this club. We do it once a month. It's a great time. It's great people. They're all smarter than me. So that's an upgrade from what you're used to. I can tell you that. The guests are always guests that people want to hear from. A lot of you guys will be familiar with many of the guests. Father Turbo's done it. Father Deacon Ananias has done it. David Patrick Carey's done it. My own priest, Father Ignatius, has done it. Father Moses McPherson's done it. It's a very good time, and I think you guys would enjoy it. If you love this content, please go to patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month. Thank you. If the United States government cut 100% of our funding, foreign aid to Israel, would this still be a possibility for Israel to do what they're doing?
No. On the one hand, they'd be able to do a lot of damage because for everybody that doesn't know, Israel does have a nuclear program. They've got at least 60 nukes. So no matter what happens, they're dangerous. But look what's happening right now. Trump supposedly, and I don't know all the details, nobody does, but Trump supposedly stopped a joint, and I don't know if it would have been joint or at least supported tangentially by the U.S. behind the scenes, this strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities, which Netanyahu and Israel, they claim to be stunned that Trump didn't want this to happen, that we thought Trump was on side, which of course I believe that's why Trump was allowed to get back in office, is because based on the past year of how Biden handled the Gaza war, the Israelis wanted a little bit less handcuffs. They saw Trump, of course, his biggest donor was Miriam Adelson, who gave him the money under the promise that Israel would be allowed to annex the West Bank under Donald Trump's presidency. So they saw Trump as sort of taking off the handcuffs that, Democrats, these more progressive that, of course, are having to answer to their very pro-Palestine base. They were kind of causing some problems. But now that Trump, we already knew that Trump was anti-war. I've always believed that Trump doesn't want to go to war with Iran. The problem is I don't think Trump understands the grip that Israel really has. And we've seen it the past week. What did Netanyahu, what's all Israeli news, what's the IDF saying? We're going to strike them regardless. We don't even need the United States' help. We're just going to do it. And the reason that's dangerous is because they are calling the United States' bluff. It's very unlikely that the U.S. will actually leave Israel out to dry, because if Israel strikes Iran's nuclear capability in a decisive way, in theory, Iran would attempt to greatly damage Israel with a retaliatory strike. And if the U.S. put its hands up and let that happen, then it actually might be lights out for Israel, and then they might literally be forced to do the Samson option, which is, blow up the whole world with nukes if we can't survive. But unfortunately, I think the Israelis are correct that that would not happen. If they called the U.S.'s bluff, did whatever they wanted, Iran retaliates, the U.S. would back them up and go to war against Iran, which is exactly what's happening right now. And I think it fits in very well with the prophecies, because what do the prophecies about the strike say? They don't say there will be a joint U.S.-Israeli strike. No, it says you will be drinking your coffee one morning and be surprised to see that the Israelis have struck, that the Jews have struck the Persian nuclear program. So I think the idea that it would ostensibly catch the U.S. off guard in some capacity is very likely. The precipitating factor, of course, being that the U.S. would basically just be forced to do what the Israelis originally wanted, which is back them up, which shows you that at the end of the day, the U.S. is not a sovereign nation.
Whose prophecy is that? Do you remember?
The one about the Iranian strike,
Coffee.
that is from
Yes.
Elder Theodore Agiofarangides, who is from Crete. He reposed in 2016. A lot of great Cretan elders recently, of course. He was friends with Eldris Galactia, who reposed in 2021. I've got a picture of her right over there in my icon corner. I got it from Metropolitan Neophytos, and she is, considered a very, very holy person that, again, reposed not too long ago. So they were from Crete. She also talked about some of this stuff, and it does also factor in with St. Paisios, who also predicted an Iranian strike on the nuclear program. And he also predicted the situation in Palestine, where he said that the Israelis would, it's tough with the Greek translation because there's so many more words in Greek, but he basically said that Gaza would be flattened like a stadium, like a sports field. And of course, I think we can all say that that's definitely already happened.
It seems, and I know this is calling water wet or the sky blue, but every foreign engagement of my adult lifetime, of my whole lifetime, has been promoted by Zionists. Every single one of them. What is with the bloodthirsty nature of these folks?
Well, there's ultimately it comes from a few angles, because obviously there are people that identify as Zionists that might identify as more peaceful. Many, if you press them on this, they'll say, "What? I just think Israel has a right to exist. I don't believe in annexing the West Bank or Gaza." But it's like, okay, the Greater Israel Project is like foundational to the entire Zionist project. Of course, the Nakba occurred in 1948, whether or not these peaceful Zionists want to acknowledge it or not. And of course, you have that whole angle. It's just a lot of narratives, right? The original narrative, of course, being that Jews who rejected Christ, they believe that they are like ethno-religiously set apart, that they are superior, that it's their job to heal the world. And that ultimately, you read the Talmud, that they want to make the Goyim, us, the Gentiles, their footstool. That's literally that is very much the goal. And of course, many Israelis are secular. They've never read the Talmud. But how does a culture that is so secular in many ways maintain this kind of this vigor? And it's because they've never had a nation. And so their tradition was to pass down this very ethno-supremacist idea that, look, they're after us. Like it's the perpetual, the Jew cries out as they strike you is really just the ultimate saying, because they have this narrative of, oh, they're hurting us. They want to hurt us. They want to genocide us. They want to take us out. And they say this as they, stab you. Of course, that's what's happening in Palestine. Look, they are literally committing a genocide in Gaza, and you talk about it, and it's like, oh, Hitler, anti-Semitism. It's like it happened 100 years ago. Why are we even talking about this? And so the combination of their religion, which of course is ethno-supremacist, the secular culture that they have passed down to maintain that ethno-supremacy in the absence of religion, combined with the fact that I think for 90% of Israel's existence, the sort of right-wing Zionist parties have been in power. And they literally, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the ultra-Zionist, currently part of Netanyahu's government, he appears many times with a map of Greater Israel, like on his speaker's lectern, which for those that don't know, Greater Israel means obviously all of Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine, Jordan, a lot of Syria, going all the way into Iraq, the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt, of course. And so this immediate territorial expansionist goal, they believe that that will secure the Jewish homeland from its domestic enemies in the Levant. And then broadly speaking, worldwide, diffusing any criticism of this, they believe will protect the Jewish diaspora from any kind of retaliation when people in the West, for example, start to come under the realization that there's a fifth column controlling their countries, which, people aren't really happy to learn that. Fun fact.
And what a slick, subversive, crafty move for Zionism and Israel to convince American Christians that somewhere in the Bible, the state of Israel as it is right now is promised to people. And I think you kind of grew up in that Christianity. I certainly did. I didn't understand why that's evil, why that's bad, why that's wrong until I came to Orthodoxy. But what a crafty, slick trick that has happened to American Christians and to believe this stuff and support it. And I think that's why, unfortunately, they have a bit of a grip on the power here. Do you think Zionism is losing a grip on power in the West?
I think it definitely is. I mean, there was a time when there was a very, I don't want to say universal, but a strong consensus for supporting Israel in the West, in America especially. And ultimately, we're realizing that, sure, it is Protestant in a lot of ways. That's where the base comes from. But ultimately, it's generational. We're seeing the only group that still, in an outsized way, supports Israel are like baby boomers and silent generation people. Everybody, left, right, center, that are younger than that, have the support for Israel has very much collapsed. And I think in many ways, that is going to be the precipitating factor on this potential Iranian strike. Because people are like, look, it's just not going to happen. Like, Trump doesn't want it to happen. These things. So from a logical perspective, you'd be like, maybe it probably won't happen. We may have bought ourselves a few years of time. But if you're Netanyahu, if you're these right-wing Zionists that are probably currently espousing one of the least popular political positions currently on the planet, they realize their time is very limited. Like if they don't do this now, while Trump, a very Zionist-backed politician, is in office in the United States, and while they still have this sort of 51% support, if they don't do it now, then they may not. Then the help that they need when they do it may not actually come for them. So I think that is really one of the biggest calculuses that people are making for why they might make this otherwise illogical decision to strike Iran now without the support of the United States, because they realize their clock is ticking. And look at Europe. Obviously, people in Europe are very liberal, cosmopolitan, humanitarian, so they very quickly sort of adopted the pro-Palestine cause. But Germany, it's like illegal to really go against Israel because they still, like, the Holocaust and the post-World War II narratives are like the law of the land there. So you can be a humanitarian in favor of Gaza all you want, but at the end of the day, you can only criticize Israel so much. And eventually that dam is going to have to break, because they probably are just going to ban, for example, the AfD, the right-wing party in Germany, because at this point, between the immigration stuff and the Israel stuff, this idea of right-wing anti-Zionist or anti-Jewish sentiment is just emerging as the obvious reality for a lot of people that are paying attention.
If there is an attack on Iran, will China jump in, do you think, to side with them?
It's a good question. Obviously, they will side with them in some capacity, whether it be soft power behind the scenes. The real quote, we don't really know exactly how much it will, how deep it will go. There are some prophecies that, talk about contingencies where the Chinese and these East Asians end up sending massive troops through Central Asia over to the Levant to deal with this. And I think in many ways, the Taiwan situation is going to be very relevant to that, because China does not want to go to war over Taiwan. For anybody that thinks that China is just desperately waiting to militarily attack the United States, that is not the case. Like, if they wanted to, they would have already, frankly. China knows that on a long enough timeline, Taiwan will be reintegrated into the People's Republic of China. It's not a question of if, but when, because there's already at least 45% of the population of Taiwan that do support complete reunification with the mainland. Taiwanese people are ethnically Chinese. They speak Chinese. They're right off the coast of China. The U.S. can only sustain this sort of perpetual buildup for so long. And so in many ways, the U.S. is the one that's interested in provoking the conflict sooner rather than later, because, look at the shipbuilding capabilities. China apparently built in the past year or 3 years or whatever it was more ships than the U.S. built since like the 1950s. Like, overall, the shipbuilding capacity are completely out of whack, to the point where China, within a few years, are going to have a navy that could be a peer power to the United States. I mean, it was only a few years ago where the United States was the only Navy that even had functional aircraft carriers. Yeah. Now China is able to have 3 aircraft carriers out of port operating in the military capacity at the same time. And all of this is in their backyard. And Russia's right there too with its Navy in Vladivostok. So fundamentally, if the US goes to war with Iran, that might be China's cue. That might even be how they help Iran, for example, is simply go into Taiwan while the US is tied up in the Middle East to the point where the US can't focus all of its military might on the Persian Gulf. Because what's US naval doctrine? It's that we need to be able to fight, 2 wars against superpowers across the globe at the same time and win. And China specifically is calling that into question right now, even Russia in Ukraine to a certain degree as well.
Mm-hmm. This is frustrating. It's like Israel doesn't stop. And we're almost forgetting, like in the larger conversation here, because of this lead up to what could or could not happen with Iran, that like what's happening in Gaza with Hamas or Palestine. What's the current state of affairs on that front?
Well, in Palestine, obviously, Gaza's taken. It's going to be hard to not see the Palestinians get expelled, right? Because that's sort of that's the goal. The Israelis want them gone. Right now, apparently, the Israelis are offering $5,000 to the Gazans to leave Gaza, to revoke the Palestinian right of return, and go to Europe and migrate right into Europe. Which, of course, that's sort of the most devious of the overall Israeli plan. Is they foment these wars, they create these refugee crises, and then they facilitate the great replacement of Europeans in the West with the wars that we are forced to fight on their behalf. And the fact that that's openly being discussed, I mean, Trump obviously talking about they've got to go, it's terrible, they got to go somewhere better. And so the question of where they're going to go is, there's these Muslim countries, Indonesia and Malaysia seem to be willing to take some of them. We're getting to the point where Somaliland is likely going to become its own independent country from Somalia for no other reason than they want to be able to send the Gazans to a certain place. Because obviously Somalia, Muslim country, it's not going to actually, go along with that unless this region is broken away. But I think ultimately the Gaza situation is not going to, unless the Iranian situation escalates before the Gazans are all expelled, I fear that unfortunately the Israelis are going to in many ways succeed in their goal in ethnically cleansing Gaza of Palestinians. However, Hamas supposedly, they continue to re-recruit their ranks. I don't know if they've ever gotten below like 30, 40,000 fighters. As everyone dies, local Palestinians are willing to join, because for many of them, I mean, it's stand here or die, right? Like, I mean, if they take the West Bank and Gaza, there is no more Palestine. I mean, people want to say that Jordan is Palestine. And yes, it is a majority Palestinian population, but Jordan is Jordan, under a king that does what Israel wants. So unfortunately, I pray for the Palestinians. Look, we remember when they struck the church hall of St. Porphyrios Orthodox Church in Gaza. It's like the 3rd oldest church in the world. These people are not good. And it's, and I think that, and every American, again, obviously you can't be held consciously responsible for everything your government does. But if you're not, sort of speaking out against some of this stuff, I would feel a little bit bad, I think.
What's going on currently with Ukraine? As we record this, there was a statement from Trump on it this morning, basically calling out Zelensky again. I believe Zelensky was saying they want to keep Crimea. I cannot remember the details as I read it before I had coffee. But what's going on that front right now? And do you see any sort of peace deal coming?
It's a good question, because obviously all the Ukrainian people are angry. They think this deal is super pro-Russian, but I disagree, actually. I think this deal is as good as Ukraine is going to get, and they're extremely stupid for not taking it, because the deal right now that seems to be on the table is the U.S. recognizes Russian sovereignty over Crimea. The front line is frozen. Russia gets all the current territory that it has, and then there's negotiations from there. There's some vague security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine can't join NATO, but they could, in theory, join the EU at some time in the future, which the Russians have even said that they would allow that. But the problem with this, and I very much hope so, and I think that the Russians are not going to agree to it, is because the Russians have no reason to agree to it.
Right.
If the Russians agreed to it, first of all, if they actually agreed to this plan, if I was a Russian patriot, if I was a patriot living in Russia, I'd be very disappointed, because that would basically be going against the Russian constitution. Because right now, large portions of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions specifically are not occupied by Russia. They're still occupied by the Ukrainian military. Those regions in their entirety, according to the Russian constitution, are part of the Russian Federation. So if Russia gives up on those, that is not a very strong reassurance to the people living in Donetsk and these places that they're going to be protected from this regime in Ukraine. We recently even saw, was it today, yesterday, Ben Shapiro, of all people, went to interview Zelensky. And I think it's sort of a damage control kind of thing, two members of the tribe coming together to help fix things up, because those are the true worst of the worst neocons, right? These Ben Shapiros, these Newland characters, these, as Douglas McGregor would say, these ethnic descendants of, enemies from that region in particular. They obviously support Israel and its expansionist goals, but they also support Ukraine because they view Russia, even though we've gone full circle with communism, capitalism, this new secular government that still is pro-Israel, they still remember that imperial Russian legacy that was truly the enemy of world Jewry. It was the enemy of proto-Zionism even. I mean, in the 1890s, the Tsar was still in power. There were huge disruptions and, conflicts between Jewish and Orthodox Christians, Cossacks, Greeks, people in all these regions. And I think as far as what we're going to see, again, there's of course always the possibility that Russia settles for another Minsk III silly type agreement. And Jim Jatras and I have been talking about it for a while, that even though, yes, the Russians, I'm grateful that they're stalling negotiations, I think, in a very good way. They realize that they have the momentum on the ground, that they are able to keep moving forward. And they have launched, for example, offensives into the Sumy and Kharkov and even, I think, Chernigov regions of Ukraine, which are not, those have not been on the table for referendums in the past. And I think that's the best sign that we have right now, that Russia realizes that they are capable of establishing the situation militarily on the ground in their favor, as opposed to, and the fact that this is the negotiations should show them that that is possible, because if it was possible at all for Ukraine to regain any territory, the U.S. wouldn't have put forward this proposal at all. So everybody knows that Ukraine isn't going to retake anything. The question is, will the U.S. fully back out if Russia because I think Russia's being vague on purpose. They want to keep pushing, but they don't want to say, we don't want to negotiate, we're just doing annexation, because obviously that would turn public opinion against them. But I think ironically, Europe is going to be what causes the U.S. to not get what it wants, which the U.S. wants to just get this thing stopped. But Europe, they've already directly countersignaled Trump's plan. They said they're going to support Zelensky to the end. And ultimately, the Russians are going to tell the Americans, look, it doesn't matter what you guys say. The Europeans are going to keep funding this terrorist states war effort regardless. So we're going to have to deal with that situation on the ground, which I think, again, if the Russians don't want to have a big future problem on their hand get played on the longer term by Turkey or NATO in a broader, more kinetic, true multi-continental third world war, they're going to need to take a lot more territory, let this war go on a bit longer than obviously the U.S. wants, and definitely firmly establish their position on the ground.
Do you think Zelensky's political career is coming to an end, or do you think he's still got a grip on power that's going to last?
It's a tough one. I don't even know if they do call elections. I'm not sure who the West is having a hard time coalescing around a figure to unite against him. We remember Zaluzhny, the military leader. Everyone thought it was going to be him, but he's now been like in exile in the UK for multiple years now. You had Yulia Tymoshenko that I think the Americans really wanted to work with. She was a female politician that had been, very high ranking even before the Maidan. But ultimately, it seems that Europe doesn't want to deal with her as much. You've got whatever his name, Alex Arestovich, the intelligence guy there, who has made a lot of criticisms of Zelensky, and some have even said he's like pro-Russian or something. So there are people in power that are trying to make overtures to the more multipolar, conservative Americans, even Russians, to say like, look, I'm a potential guy that could emerge out of this. I think the Russians still want Medvedchuk, who was that pro-Russian guy that they had to do a huge prisoner exchange for, who had been arrested and tortured after the SMO. I think the Russians still want him, but that is also very unrealistic. So the Russians wanting him shows that, I think that's another sign of them saying like, yeah, put this guy in, knowing that they would never put that guy in, and they're just going to keep pushing. So for better or for worse, Zelensky, he's managed to hold on, I think in no small part due to his Talmudic background. He has a lot of friends in high places when you come from that community. But ultimately, there is, I think he must have a contingency plan for how he's going to get out of Ukraine should things fall apart. I think the UK or somebody probably like, look, we'll get you out if things go bad. So I think he's willing to play the long game because I think he has his personal salvation, at least on this earth, secure. Because there's always that chance of like, say the war effort falls apart. You get some of these Azov types, these hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, they might be the ones that want to come and, make an example of him and do something because this whole Ukrainian identity thing has gotten out of control.
Any prophecies given regarding that area that you can talk about from saints?
Well, there are a few. There are, of course, there's one of my favorites from St. Lawrence of Chernigov and others, which even predicted the schism. That's one of the big things going on, of course, is the schismatic Orthodox Church in Ukraine, supported by the Ecumenical Patriarch, have been stealing churches, violently persecuting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical church under Metropolitan Onufry. And there were prophecies about how this schism arising in like Little Russia, the Russians coming in, and there being a time of war, but ultimately the Ukrainians coming back under, at least a lot of parts of Eastern Ukraine coming back under the fold of the Russian Federation. But there are also prophecies around this time as well about how if Russia doesn't adequately repent, that there are even prophecies that say that China will take Siberia, for example, or that they'll face an enemy in the East. And of course, I've been to Russia semi-recently. I can confirm that there is an Orthodox Renaissance occurring there. It's not to say there aren't problems in Russia and critiques I could make, but I think as long as Russia the state as well, continues to facilitate and bolster the growth of the church there, these prophecies about the schism, these prophecies about Russia taking Ukraine, even these prophecies, for example, about the Antichrist and with the new czar and all these sorts of things coming about, I think the more positive angles of those will continue to come to pass if the church in Russia continues to grow and they don't fall for. You can even see in Russia, there's very obvious traps of ecumenism with Islam because of the large Muslim population, the mass migration stuff, I think the Israel thing. If Russia doesn't, more definitively side against Israel, I wouldn't be surprised if that led to, civilizational consequences in the more metaphysical realm. So, between St. Lawrence of Chernigov, St. Jonah of Edessa, Elder Zosima of Donbass, people can look up some of these names. They had many very interesting prophecies about the Maidan, what's currently going on in Ukraine, and the future that also involve Russia's clashes with Turkey in the future. For example, Strelkov, Igor Strelkov, who the hero of Donbass, the reason that the SMO was eventually able to be fought in 2022, because from 2014 onwards, he fought against the Ukrainian Nazis, the nationalists there on the ground, and helped the people. He held that front line that was much farther back before the SMO started. And he's in jail in Russia for criticizing the government for not going hard enough in the SMO. Right. And he's given a lot of geopolitical analysis. And he's a staunch Orthodox Christian. He knew many of these saints that I had discussed. And he, years ago, was talking about how Syria is a weak point for the Russians, how Turkey will be taking over Syria and the southern flank of Turkey, all these Turkish states, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. These are Turkic countries that have a big affinity with Turkey, and how Russia is allowing its southern flank to be built up against. And in Syria is going to be this very dangerous geopolitical domino for the Russians because they're ignoring the Turkish threat. And of course, he's in jail now. So there are dangers that I think if people in the Russian government wanted to get ahead of a lot of these geopolitical developments, they would actually listen to the prophecies more.
I have been calling, at least I'd say the last 10 years, sort of an age of revelation. It seems to me like people are seeing things a lot differently than just 10 years ago they saw things. And I want to ask you about what sort of things have been revealed to us from your perspective, and tie that in with sort of the importance of certain saints and the prophecies that they've made, and then things that you learn from some of the elders on Mount Athos. Can you tie all of that in and things that have been happening and how we're seeing things in a, let's say, more clear manner than maybe we were 10 years ago?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the best ways to explore that, of course, Metropolitan Neophytos, a few years ago, he really came out publicly talking about this stuff. And then he had built up enough of an audience to where people were paying attention to him during COVID when he resisted, for example, the COVID mandates. And what did he say? He said, I believe it was St. Porphyrios told Metropolitan Neophytos, after your 50th year, so once you turn 50, you will start to speak and the whole world will listen. And he's like, what does that even mean? Because this is in like the 80s. He was being told this. And he's like, it will be the technology of the time will facilitate your voice being heard around the world. And this is before the internet. So and this is in like rural Cyprus as well. He had no idea what he was talking about. Of course, comes about. We're on YouTube, we're on StreamYard, Substack, we're on all these things right now, and everyone's talking about this. And now we know, people are talking about the prophecies. People are coming to orthodoxy. We know there's an Orthodox Renaissance because of the internet, which I think is probably the biggest. If you talk about an age of revelation, that's the most important revelation, the truth of the faith. And you look at these prophecies, which many have already come to pass, whether it's what's happening in Gaza, whether it's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and whether what's about to happen in Iran. A lot of, you get into the more hardcore esoteric, like, wow, do you really believe that kind of prophecies? It's about a coming golden age of orthodoxy, because of course we know, you read the Apocalypse, it talks about, the gospel will have to be preached to all four corners of the globe before the Antichrist, before any of this kind of stuff that people like to talk about will happen. And frankly, maybe with rare exceptions, if you're talking about Protestantism and Catholicism, it seems the gospel has been preached across most of the world. When you look at South America, when you look at Africa, when you look at Oceania, and you understand that there's definitely still a need for orthodoxy in the most basic form to still be preached there, I think it starts to make a lot of sense that that is what the true gospel is in the context of these eschatological revelations. And as these things happen, as these prophecies of these latter-day saints is fulfilled, that alone, I think, will get people curious about orthodoxy. But more than that, of course, the situation in Istanbul and Constantinople, if Constantinople comes back under Orthodox control, if, again, there's this big conflict and there's sort of even a new world order for a time, which will ultimately become the new world order of the Antichrist, much like the Roman Empire, which persecuted millions of Christians. The Roman Empire's road network facilitated the spread of the gospel, much like right now the internet is facilitating not just the spread of these prophecies, but facilitating catechesis and connecting people with Orthodox communities. That is what's happening right now. And I don't think anyone would deny that the internet is going to play a profound role in our future enslavement to a very, very evil system. But of course, God would still use those mechanisms to his ends. For the Holy Spirit will still work through that, because the evil plans of men God can use for good. So I think that is very much what we are living through right now. And on top of all that Orthodox stuff, there's obviously, even just the presence of police body cams are waking people up to these nonsense narratives about white privilege and all the BLM kind of stuff. So a lot of this technology that we know is ultimately going to be bad in the long term, at least right now, God is making sure that some important ideas and foundations are laid within people through these mediums, which I think is, we definitely can't take that for granted. As much as there are terrible things on the internet, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. And I can't harp on this enough, because it's so obvious right now for people listening. I know Conrad already knows this, but just watch in our spaces and this sort of quote unquote alt media, the voices that get upset when you speak about one certain country and you don't side with. Just, it's so obvious at that point who's working for who. And so, I say remain vigilant against that sort of thing. Conrad, again, you started with doing it, so we can end with doing it as well. Nice bookend of you plugging whatever you'd like to plug.
That was a great conversation, Buck. We could keep going for hours here, but I know we gotta do this. But worldwarnow.co or worldwarnow.substack.com, both links work. That's where you get access to every episode of World War Now, which is my free weekly news show with my co-host Dimitri. You get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes, which if you become a paid subscriber, that's where you get the full show. Again, that's Dimitri and I. We interview a lot of people. We talk about, less current events, more esoteric, historical kind of ideas, space being fake, a lot of Israel Zionist stuff that may be more historical as opposed to what's going on right now. We talk about all of that. And then, of course, there's the World War Now YouTube channel, where I do my weekly World War live stream, where you can ask me questions live and I'll answer them. I play a lot of I'll play games, have a good time, hang out with everybody. Follow World War Now on X as well at World War Now _. And if you want to keep up with my more personal ramblings, I'm on X as well at Gnomrad, like a garden gnome, GNOMERAD. So that's all my stuff.
Excellent. Conrad, thanks for being here again on Counterflow.
Thank you, Buck. It's always a pleasure.
All right. What a great discussion. Conrad's always good. The young man knows his stuff. Thanks again, Conrad, for being here. As for the show, the subscribers on the YouTube page are inching upward daily. So please be one of them. Hit the subscribe button. You'll be aware of then when these shows drop. You can find us in the Telegram channel. You can follow me on X at Buck Rebel, BuckRebel. Welcome to the surge of new folks that followed me this past week. Lots of help getting me over the 10,000 mark. The last kick over the mark was from our friend Oren McIntyre. That was very kind of him. And boy, that did it quickly. And let's see, next week, we are going to dive in to Mormonism with an Orthodox Christian who was steeped in Mormonism. We're going to jump down that rabbit hole, and I think it's going to be fascinating. Until then, you guys have a good one. See ya.
Like the sound of the Counterflow Podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.